Welcome to our eighth Fireside Chat of the year. My name is Kirk Hanson. I'm the Director of Forestry for the Northwest Natural Resource Group, and glad to have you all joining us for a special edition of our regular monthly Fireside Chats. Last month, we focused we had a guest speaker from the San Juan Islands, Hoffman-Krull with the San Juan Conservation District. And this evening, I'm joined by one of my other favorite human beings, Carson Sprenger, a consulting forester from Orcas Island, also specializing in forestry within the San Juans. So these past 2 weeks, we've been kind of focusing on San Juan Island or San Juan County forest ecology. And tonight, we're going to be taking a deep dive into fire ecology. So even if you're not from the San Juan Islands, I think this topic, the information is going to be very relevant to you and your forests. A little bit about the format of the evening. After my introductions here, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Carson. He'll be our keynote speaker for the evening. Kai will be jumping in, I think at some point with some comments also from his perspective, working with small woodland owners in the islands. And after our presentation on fire ecology, we'll open it up to general discussion. If you happen to have any questions during the presentation, you're welcome to type them into the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And Alex will take a look at those and screen those and select from some of those questions rather, and pose those to Carson and Kai. And then after that, we'll open it up for more of a general discussion, question and answer. I'd love to hear from people, some perspectives from your own woodlands. And that'll wrap it up for the hour. If you are new to these fireside chats, they are being hosted by our organization, the Northwest Natural Resource Group. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, specialize in ecologically based forest management and small woodlands management. And we work all over Western Washington. So if you are a small woodland owner and interested in ecologically based forest management, we welcome you to visit our website where we have all sorts of information on forestry. As well as a calendar of all sorts of different events coming up. If you're in the San Juan Islands, we have an event coming up next month in October on Shaw Island on this topic, managing for forest health and climate adaptation and reducing fire risk. And both Carson and Kai and myself will be at that event. So we welcome you to come to that. And otherwise, we also have other workshops happening on the mainland and additional online events. So you can check out our events page on our website, nnrg.org. And Alex also in the chat box put in a link to a San Juan's resource page on our website. So again, if you are from the San Juan Islands, we have some very kind of custom tailored information for folks in that special environment ecology there, and you can take a look at the information on our website. I think that's it. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Carson to introduce himself and take it from here on our topic of fire ecology within the San Juan Islands. Thanks, Carson, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kirk. I will say first off, I'm in a little bit of a different time zone. I was just in Sweden at a ISA conference, International Society of Arboriculture, and in Denmark, and I got back Sunday, and I caught a little bit of COVID. I'm generally fine, but I do feel like it's about 4 a.m. But I will get over that, I'm sure, in a few days. I had a remarkable time. In fact, there was 700 participants at the conference from all over the world, all tree nerds, and very interested in making the world a better place with trees in it. So lots to share with many of you at a later date on that. So I'm from the San Juan Islands. I grew up here, and I got my master's University of Washington in fire ecology. And I had the pleasure of, and the good fortune rather, of having a study site in the San Juan Islands. And I studied the fire history of Gary Oak and Douglas Fir on south portion of Waldron Island. It's not the only fire history that's been done in the San Juans, but I looked specifically at the southern slopes of Waldron and put together the story of a particular preserve and its interaction of fire across the landscape. And it was just quite a remarkable opportunity to look back in time and to try to piece together ecological events and come up with some meaningful insights into what that means, not just for the history, but what that means for us today as managers. Sometimes I feel like it answers questions, but it also presents a lot of questions. So it doesn't answer all of the questions. What I propose to do is I have a series of slides that will sort of display some of the thinking that I have on what sets San Juan Island, San Juan County forests apart a little bit, and how we characterize them, some ecological terminology, which is beneficial, and then some slides that present how we go about coming up with a fire history and sort of what that means and what that means in terms of managing fuels and understanding how forests respond, and not just to the fire events, but a period in time when we do not have fire. So with a little bit of coaching from Alex, I will figure out how best to share my slides.
Yeah, do you have the share screen button at the bottom of your Zoom screen? Okay, yeah, I think if you just click that and then select the program that your slides are in, PowerPoint or Google Slides.
See this here. And I think I can go to, can I go to slide mode? Should I do that before I shared screen, or?
I think that you should be able to do it from here. We can see your screen now.
Let's see if we can do.
Yeah, go ahead and click start slideshow, and it should work just fine.
So where is that, Kirk?
The slideshow at in the top menu bar. Click on slideshow, and it should say start from beginning. Yep, there we go.
Okay, and
yep,
cool.
It's working.
Okay, great. So I will move fairly quickly through these because I want to leave plenty of time for discussion. So what defines our forests? And there are a few things that I like to discuss. In San Juan County, I think it's fair to say we have high geophysical variability. So what that really means is lots of landscapes and lots of topography and just lots of variation and over relatively small scales. So maybe think of Orcas Island and lots of hills and valleys and draws. The glacial activity combined with previous geological activity just creates lots of variation. Very important is our climate. And not only are we in the Pacific Northwest, where we experience the Pacific high predictably each summer. So we talked about dry conditions when some of us got together. And predictably, we have a very dry summer. And in the San Juans, we are also in the rain shadow of the Olympic Mountains. So both of those are significant. Soils are a really important factor. In particular, we've had a lot of glacial scouring. So we have bare, thin rock. In places we have what's called perched water tables. So we have impervious sections of soil that can hold water in the winter and then become just crushingly dry in the summer. And we also have young soils. Disturbance. And this is a forestry term or ecologist term that some folks may not be totally familiar with, but disturbance for a forest, think of it in terms of events. Let's say a snow event or an avalanche or a wind event. Even an individual tree falling over from wind creates a bit of exposed soil, creates a different light environment, and really can change the trajectory of a developing forest. And fire is a disturbance. And I just kind of put that down at the end because it has such importance. So what else defines our forests here in San Juan County? The human history? Yes, the human history for sure. That is a big influence from both pre-settlement times. And we talk about pre-settlement, that's prior to the active settlement of Euro-Americans, and that's during Coast Salish times, and post-settlement. We have a lot of influence from the farming practices, in particular grazing, clearing land, logging practices, and the big one, which is lack of fire or fire exclusion. I like this slide because this is Orcas Island. And this, does anyone know what this particular slide is mapping? What are those polygons? Does anyone have a clue? And I'm fine if anyone wants to shout something out.
I think Janet has a guess.
Okay, I see a hand.
It's geological. It's like a fruitcake, a geological fruit.
Yeah, it's a whole messed up. It's a layer cake.
A layer cake. Okay.
Yeah, this is a map of soil types. So these were mapped soil types. So this gives some idea of the variation, that geophysical variation over relatively small spatial scales. And that is kind of a feature of our history, and one that strongly has influence over forests and vegetation. And I will say, just as a side note, I don't mind at all if you have yourselves unmuted and shout out with a question. After all, this is a chat, so you can feel free to interrupt me. As a reminder, here is our annual precipitation in general. And Friday Harbor, 28 inches a year. Seattle gets a bit more, 36. Portland, 43. South end of Lopez is around 13 to 15. Okay, so that's not much precipitation. And there's that curve. And I think what, these are on average, right? So we all have in our memories, periods during the summers where we get no precipitation for 3-4 months at a time. And it only seems to be exacerbating that effect. And I also will mention that somebody mentioned the wet winter. I think it was you, Janet, the wet spring, wet winter. And the allocation of precipitation tends to be real heavy in the fall, winter, spring. And over the past 10 years, I've observed even greater amount of precipitation in the late winter, early spring. And that has some consequences as well. I like this photograph because, and this is taken from Stewart Island, actually. So it sort of kind of puts all of that little ecological thinking into play. That is, we have a glacially scoured, I believe this is conglomerate, where below the moss on the top there really isn't any soil. It's just sitting on top of rock. And where you have aspect, southern aspects collect far more sun than a north aspect. And on the south side, which is where this little madrona tree is on the left, it's quite warm. There's probably a small little pocket of soil there. But there really is not enough soil and indeed excessive amounts of drying solar radiation where almost nothing will grow. And over just a very short distance, as you head to the north, you get a cooler aspect. So more shading, more available moisture, and a different suite of vegetation can occupy the site, and in fact is fully occupying the site. And you'll have situations where you have red cedar, which is a moisture-loving species, on the north side of a small rock outcrop. And then just 50, 60 feet away, you'll have madrone and maybe a Gary oak growing on a very dry, southerly exposed rock. So you have what we call, ecologists would be a steep environmental gradient. And this is a feature of our forest where we have very different habitat types relatively close together, all mashed together. So again, that speaks to the high degree of variability, both in vegetation assemblages and then also in terms of structure. So we're gonna talk about fire history, right? And the main tool as an ecologist that we use to tease apart fire history is looking at the tree rings. What sort of story is held in the tree rings? And remember, some of you will remember that trees put on a growth ring every year, at least if we're not in the tropics, if we're in the northern or southern hemisphere, they put on a growth ring every year. And that living tissue can record events. A wide ring is typically associated with a good growing year, available moisture and other conditions. A very narrow ring, maybe a drought year. But the tree rings also record disturbance, and in particular, fire. And if a fire is not too hot and it's the right species, it will heat up the cambium and maybe scorch the cambium and leave an impression in that year. And as dendrochronologists, we can go back, if we have the samples, and we can tease apart when those events occurred. And it's nice because we have that annual resolution. So what is a fire history? Well, in essence, you're going to characterize the role of fire in a particular ecosystem. And you describe the natural variability and frequency, in some cases, the severity and extent, and spatial complexity. So this was this Waldron Island, and that'll get you a little bit oriented just to kind of show you where most of my samples were taken. We had other evidence that suggest that things were changing. And there's an example of a large old growth Douglas fir here. That's Brenda Beckwith. This is an archaeologist. And we had some observations from this tree. Well, we had charcoal on the bark, and charcoal persists for quite a long time. So we knew there was fires in the past, and at the base of the tree there actually was fire scar. So that means it was deeply left a deep mark at the base of the tree. And we had evidence that the tree was formerly more open grown, so it had the remnants of very large open canopy, and some of those branches were pruned away by likely past fire events. The other photo shows Gary oak, and it shows Gary oak growing in such a way that it is not ideal for its persistence in the long term. That is, there's a young grove of encroaching conifers, in this case Douglas fir, that are coming up and growing right through it. So this is not a situation where the oak will be happy for all that long. The Douglas fir will soon overtop this. So things are changing. We see evidence of rapid change. With the sampling for the fire history, we located the fire-scarred trees, removed partial or sometimes full cross sections, and removed a number of cores. And there's the increment core. And we sanded all these samples up, and we carefully looked at the rings and assigned the dates. And some of the results, we had 62 total fire scars, 31 fire years from 1530 to 1908. And we found no fires after 1908. And let's see, I need to move this little thing here. Right. In summary, I had a couple different analysis periods. That historic period where I had good samples was from the year 1700 to 1879. So the mean fire return interval was 8.5 years. In fact, using a different statistical measure, we used the Weibull mean probability index at 7.4 years. So there was a fire every 7.4 years, 7.5 years. Think about that for a moment. And after active European settlement, when we looked at how many fires were, there was a fire about every 37 years. And in fact, when I show you this, another graphic here, you'll see that the 3 fire events I had from 1880 to 2004 were all really close, right around 1900. So they were not well distributed. Let's see here. There we go. So this is fire history graphic that displays years along the bottom. And then each one of the horizontal bars are my individual samples. And then there's a line with dates, with years, in fact. And you can see that you can see each year there was recorded fire, and you can see some of the individual samples line up and had recorded years in common. In fact, 1807, if you see that, there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 trees that recorded those fire events. And you can see how they're distributed, and you can see how year 1530 was my oldest sample. I recorded fires that year. And, there we go. So this is that sort of analysis, this historic analysis period. That's every 7.4, 7.5 years, there was a fire on average. And in some periods, there was just a few years between fire events. And these are, let me just remind you something, these are trees that are recording the fire events. And we know that trees are good recorders of fire, but not perfect. So it's very likely that we missed some events. Maybe the fire was just not hot enough. Maybe the fire just moved around and didn't scar a particular tree. So this is probably a conservative estimate, okay? And then there's our sort of, period of active European settlement, Euro-American settlement. I get a statistic of 37 years, but you can see how those are quite distributed around 1900. I had 3 fire events. So for this particular study site, in fact, I know, all the way up until this year, there still has not been a fire since 1908. So, do you have a question, Janet?
Firstly, does taking a core sample harm the tree?
Taking a core sample does, affect the tree somewhat. I mean, you are removing a section of wood and you are severing tissue. For resinous species that have rot-resistant wood and phenols, in general, they will recover just fine. So they'll fill that void full of resin, and very likely nothing will get in there. And it typically doesn't adversely affect them.
That would be Douglas fir.
Maybe Douglas fir, yeah. If you did this on an alder or a maple, I'd say a different story. You likely could be introducing decay fungi.
So also there was a disastrous fire called the Big Burn. This is around 1910 or something. Mm-hmm. And that initiated a period of active fire suppression nationally, right?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's evident in your records.
Well, I suppose you could read that, but from the history, I know that most of those fires were inland Northwest. So that was like Eastern Washington, Idaho, Montana, And those were, it was a very dry year, but also like there was a huge amount of logging slash on the ground and active fires already burning. And then it was most of the 10 million acres that burned, I think, was just over a few days of high winds. So that historic fire return rule, this is back to the data here on Waldron, is frequent, yet it was highly variable. There was, quite great deal of variation. And one thing we could say from the data was the longer intervals between fire events led to larger fires. So there were some periods where there was, I think, a 34-year period where there were no fires, and then a great deal of samples recorded those fire events. So we could infer that with an absence of fire, the fires were likely larger in size, they covered a greater area, and perhaps they burned with greater intensity. And so that sort of makes sense from what we understand about the buildup of fuel. When you don't have a fire for a few years or a decade or so, the shrubs accumulate, there's more duff, more down litter, more small trees starting, and all that stuff can be quite flammable. When you do have the fire, it burns with greater intensity. So it does, doing my research, although I was really looking at the ecology, I began to really have a hard time avoiding the question of what caused these fires. And we have ethnographic evidence that suggests that humans did light fires, but I didn't know. I couldn't go back in time. I was not sure. And I needed, some confirmation. And we had to look at it sort of tangentially. We do know that lightning strikes are rare. We have a relatively low elevation. And we also know that fire suppression is nearly absent. There was, locally, there was, no effort to suppress fire, or very little, certainly on where my study site was located. We also know that there were archaeological sites recorded, so there were known Coast Salish sites on Walden, so there was human activity. And then one feature that really bubbled up was had a long fire-free period. It was 31 years. So it was 1776 to 1807. That was this one that was sort of sandwiched in the middle of a lot of fire activity. And after digging through the literature, I kept coming back to the introduction of smallpox to Puget Sound. And smallpox was very virulent. And in fact, it had a mortality rates of 70 or 80% into some of the coastal tribes in Pacific Northwest. Well, smallpox came into the Seattle or Puget Sound area in 1775. And we don't know the history on Waldron Island. We don't know the families or how many people died or any of that. But we do know that, well, smallpox came in 1775. And lo and behold, we have a 31-year period where there's no fire. So if the disease came, and likely it did all the way through, it was incredibly disruptive. And perhaps it would have, we could surmise, it disrupted their land management practices. And we know, we have some confirmation, 1807, if you recall, a lot of fire scars, my recorder trees recorded fires. So I think it's fair to assume that that first fire that came back was indeed large. So it probably was 1807. So we don't definitively know for sure what happened with the disease and the human history. But this is sort of somewhat of a confirmation that, people that lived here that were almost certainly lighting these fires, had a strong effect on their landscape. And something as significant as a very virulent disease could also affect the landscape. Some other studies from around our county. There was a study on Lopez, a study on Stewart Island. I was involved with that one, as well as Henry Island and Pecos Island. And for the most part, we have every 7 to 15 years was the fire return interval. So similar vegetation types, but well distributed throughout the islands. A similar story. Most researchers agreed that the historic fires were of low intensity. And again, they agreed that the ignition sources were likely human. And for most sites, the burning stopped 100 to 150 years ago. So a quick kind of a little crude relationship I wanted to display is the relationship between accumulation of woody fuels and the fire return interval, right? So if you have low amounts of woody fuel and you have you typically have a short fire return interval, or that short fire return interval tends to not allow much fuels to accumulate. So kind of the other end of this, we have long return intervals, we have long periods between fire events, we generally get more fuel accumulating in brush, like I said, small trees falling, greater amounts of fuel. So there is a relationship between accumulation of woody fuels and the frequency of the fire events. And it's the frequency of fire events that typically generate or drive the woody fuel amounts. Another thing that we have are shifts in species composition. So you have a longer fire return interval, so greater periods between fires. You typically get an increase in fire intolerant species. And there are some species that are quite comfortable with fires and others that really are avoiders, would prefer that if there were no fires, or if a fire comes, they're going to be killed and they have to start again. So we would refer to those as fire intolerant species. So typically that's thinner barked species. And if we're talking in the world of conifers, let's just go right to conifers. Hemlock, grand fir, cedar is kind of in the middle. And hardwood species, most of them are relatively intolerant to fire as well. There it is. Grand fir, hemlock, and cedar is sort of in the middle. And you have a decrease in your fire adapted species. You just don't have the conditions, and species like oak, native bunch grasses tend to decrease with those longer fire return intervals. All right, a little bit of a summary here. So our current fire exclusion, let's say it's been on Waldron, we're going back to Waldron for a moment. So 1908 was the last fire, it's over 100 years. So I can say with my research, that's the longest in the last 500 years. But what we know about human history now is they were likely fires being lit on the landscape under a current regime of maybe the last 2,000 years. So think about this, in the last 2,000 years, a significant time period, our forests have not experienced a period without fire as long as is the current period. So in 2,000 years, we're in a new regime. We really are in a new period. And you have significant structural and compositional changes, a broad shift in species towards a greater proportion that are intolerant of fire or don't need fire, and a gradual reduction in those species that are either dependent on fire or really are promoted by fire. And along with that is a loss of some habitat types. So loss of our woodlands, our open grown woodlands. So those are trees with greater amount of space, deeper crowns, and typically herbaceous or grassy understories. So you have that woody vegetation encroaching or coming in, and you have shade tolerant species encroaching and coming in. And in general, we have those increase in fuel loads or high fuel loads. And associated with the high fuel loads is that greater increase, what we'd say a high severity fire. Another thought is with that current extended period of fire exclusion, it's just an increase in overall forest cover. This is something that sometimes gets a little bit lost, is that 150 years ago, we had fewer trees than we have now. And that's a little bit surprising to some of you. We had larger trees and there was greater space between them. But we have a lot of young forests now, and young, dense forests. And so just on the number of trees, we're not talking about quality necessarily, but the number of trees has increased. Even with our development and clearing and farming, the number of trees has increased. And certainly increase in tree density. And with that high occupation of trees on site, we have a greater susceptibility to drought. There's just less available moisture. This, in many cases, in many forests that I've seen, leads to just greater insect and disease issues. Pathogenic fungi and root rots tend to accelerate when you have high stress and high tree density, and insects have more opportunities. And lastly, and importantly, we have an increase in those, what we would term catastrophic fires. And just because we have the density doesn't mean we're going to have a catastrophic fire. Remember, you do need the weather, and you do need the ignition. So lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't just mention that charcoal has very likely an important role in our ecosystems and our soil. And without these historic fires, we are lacking the contribution and the recruitment of charcoal. And charcoal has important connection between roots and mycorrhizae and microorganisms, and it stores a lot of carbon in the soil, increases water holding capacity, etc. So the lack of new charcoal deposition may be contributing to a decline in forest health. So those are my slides, and we can get back to chatting here.
Okay, thanks, Carson. Yeah, I appreciate that. Before we open it up to chatting, conversation, Q&A, I did want to check in with Kai Hoffman-Krull, the Forest Health Director for the San Juan Conservation District. Kai, do you have anything that you want to add to this from your perspective, working with small woodland owners, working across the islands, and from the Conservation District's perspective?
Yeah, no, that's thanks, Kirk and Carson. Really a pleasure to get to see that. Of certainly elements of that presentation I've seen before, but fun to see it all collected together. I think just a few other pieces I might toss in there. If you over the last week's webinar, we touched base also on the role of ash content in soil, and I think that is just one other piece, this of sort of the regular contribution of ash and charcoal in forest soils played a series of different roles, but ash had a very unique role in terms of having high calcium and magnesium, which then washes those exchange sites on soil particles that otherwise are trying to fill up with hydrogen molecules, and washing those exchange sites then makes it available for other trace minerals to be able to bond and then become a part of that transfer that happens within the soil ecosystem. And so that content only lasts for a series of, or the washing effect of calcium magnesium only lasts for, kind of degrades over time, but really only between 5 to 10 years. And so this is part of the role of these regular fire return intervals playing, are offering regular amounts of ash and charcoal into the soil profiles. There's just a significant change that we then are experiencing based off of what Carson stated about this long period of now fire suppression. And so I think that does raise some really interesting questions of how do you mimic some of those strategies within some of these overstocked forests, which certainly, I think sometimes the language can go too hyperbolic towards the risk of catastrophic fire, but of course, then we also are really certainly presented with a series of new challenges that we've never really faced, right? We haven't had a catastrophic fire in the islands during this period. We understand from, the fires in the region, the series of weather events that have to take place, and certainly an east wind event is paramount in terms of making those fires really reach that catastrophic level. But we certainly have a lot of the elements that could lead to some of these really stand replacing fires. High congestion of young conifers, as Carson was mentioning, and those young conifers also are more susceptible to fire because they don't have the bark retardant developed in those more mature trees. And so, you have a lot of flammable material that's not very resistant to fire within concentrated areas. If the right weather event does come through, it could be really problematic. So we have to then think about the reintroduction of fire in a very strategic way that really takes into account all of the potential risks. And I think a lot of people come to their own conclusions about sort of, some people just say, let's just keep fire completely out of the forest. And I think that there's some real, some reasons to support that notion. And I think chipping is a great method if people are not wanting to use fire to be doing some biomass processing. Certainly a lot of the tools that Kirk has talked about in different workshops in terms of lop and scatter and aggregated material for constructed nurse log habitat. There's a lot of different ways to utilize biomass. But I certainly would say that conservation burns have been a method that the district is certainly a proponent of. We utilize it a lot in the ICC, which is the Islands Conservation Corps program that I manage, working on public lands in San Juan County. And those are basically 5 to 6 foot burn, or 6 foot in diameter burn piles that are mostly of similar size material, usually branches. And we light those off in the wintertime when conditions are safe, using wax paper to keep them dry, and then extinguish them when they're at coal stage to be able to maximize the charcoal production for the reasons that Carson mentioned. So I would, don't just take that amount of information and then go run with it, but there certainly are educational opportunities to use fire safely in your forests, and something that if you come to the workshop on Shaw or future workshops with NNRG, definitely a topic that we can dive into more extensively.
Okay, thanks, Guy. Well, with that, with the remaining time that we have left within this hour, I'd like to open it up. First of all, Alex, if any questions have come in through the chat function, and then after that, open it up to more general conversation amongst folks.
Yeah, Andrew asked if there are any plans for prescribed burns on the islands. And Carson, that last photo on your slide is probably from one, right?
Yes, correct. That was a burn on Yellow Island. The benefit of Yellow Island is it's a tiny little island, and that speaks to the issues that it's logistically just a huge challenge, right? And I would say, and I'm curious to what Guy has to say on this too, but when I was doing restoration plans 15 years ago, and we would talk to the Washington Department of Natural Resources, they would just laugh us off of the phone call and say like, "Ha, never, sorry." And that was just kind of the assumption it was never going to happen. Although ecologically, we always kind of held out some hope that there would be a way to be able to conduct these. And I think from my experience of being on a prescribed fire crew, that it really just takes, you have to have multiple stakeholders, and you have to have people okay with the level of risk, willing to take the risk, but really have expertise. And that's burn practitioners, that's people that understand weather, and people that can implement something. And so I always held out hope, and it seems like maybe things are getting a little closer. And I think we have to think about what is a meaningful scale, what's a doable scale, and probably think of pretty small scale burn. But yeah, go ahead, Kai. Tell me what you think might be on the horizon.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks. So ICC is actually going to be involved in a prescribed burn on Jones Island this fall, which is, as you said, multiple stakeholders. So both the Department of Natural Resources and Washington State Parks have been really involved in organizing that burn. It's actually the second burn that's happened on Jones in the last 3 years. Jones fits the same criteria as Yellow that Carson was saying in terms of being a relatively contained island with much infrastructure. And obviously there's a whole set of challenges and liability when you start getting into the notion of prescribed burns on more inhabited islands. Now, I will say that there's as Carson's saying, there's a lot of ecological benefits and rationale for why reintroducing fire on that sort of scale really does make a lot of sense. And the Department of Natural Resources has been really championing prescribed fire over the last 4 years, and have actually been developing a whole new program called the Certified Burner Program that is training practitioners across the state of Washington in prescribed fire techniques, and also then through that process actually taking some of the liability on for those burns if those practitioners are actually then going and implementing. And it's a very complicated subject, but one that I hope that we can continue to have a really positive discussion around, because I think people, when we talk about prescribed fire, the immediate thought is, oh wow, that's incredibly risky, right, to be lighting a fire off in your forest. And I would say, yes, that's true in some ways, but also most prescribed burns go great. And those are the conditions where people are choosing the weather, the fuels, and have a lot of the tools necessary to make that operation successful and safe. And then it's processing the fuels that will have a fire move through it at some point when we're not choosing those conditions, right? And so we think about the risk of introducing fire in that controlled way. We don't oftentimes then totally understand the risk of not processing those fuels in some form. And again, I would just end with this piece that it's a fire adapted ecosystem. And I was out 2 years ago, Tom DeLuca, who's the dean of the OSU Forestry School, was out working on a research project on Waldron Island. And we were boating back, and it was super smoky, right? It was right in the midst of fire season. And I was saying, gosh, a lot of folks are complaining about the smoke right now. And Tom laughed and he said, it's kind of like complaining about cold weather. He's like, smoke's just going to happen. Like fire is just going to happen. These are fire adapted ecosystems. We can't pretend that we're going to keep fire at bay forever. So this relationship of how do we use that in a systematic, controlled, safe way is a huge topic of conversation, and one that I think will continue to evolve over the next 5 and 10 years.
Thanks, guys. Alex, any other questions coming in through the chat?
No, I don't think we had any more from the chat.
Okay. Well, I'd love to open it up. Folks that are on the call this evening, does anybody else have any questions specific to their own forests, or any anecdotes, anything you're doing to reduce fire risk, or questions about fire risk within your own forests?
I have a question that's not related to my forest, but the question that I had after your presentation, Carson, was that were the Native American burns mainly to keep oak, savanna, and grasslands intact, or were they also just as much happening in the canopy of conifers? And I mean, maybe we don't know that, but I mean, a lot of your research is from conifer cores. So obviously it was happening in the conifers, but how much in the conifers? Just the edges of the oak savannas, the prairies?
Yeah, I mean, well, let's see. One part of your question was like kind of the reason that were, the reasons for the burns, right? And by the Native Americans, what were they doing the burns for? I think was what I heard you asking. And there are, to answer that, there are some things we know, but probably more that we don't know. And we could make some educated guesses, but I think they were burning for all sorts of reasons. And certainly fire is something that is not completely containable or trainable. And I think of those edges where, my samples were typically around the edge of the pure savanna, right? There were no trees in the savanna. I didn't have any sample trees in the savanna. And we do know that they were burning certainly for promotion of the camas and other food crops, right? But back to that, not very containable or trainable, I think the fire would just kind of move off into the edges, and certainly it would go upslope and it would find things to burn. So was I picking up the sort of incidental edges of the fires, or was I picking up a signal that was, the epicenter of where they were burning? It may really be impossible to answer that question. But when I think of the sort of the types of vegetation that we have now, and sort of the remnants of the historic vegetation, I think fires had a way of finding things to burn, and the maybe the cooler, darker forest types on the north aspects probably didn't burn every year or every time that there was a fire, but maybe every 4 or 5 times the conditions were right, so that the fire went over the edge and burned that particular stand. But one thing I do know that's very interesting, and actually I was just going to mention this. I'm assuming most all of you own property or are familiar with property or a land or a parcel of land that you really enjoy or spend time on. And I have found almost no place in the San Juans that doesn't have some evidence of fire. And I find it an enjoyable exercise to head out on that land, head out on that parcel that and go look around, do some investigative work, find an old stump, look for the charcoal that may be hidden in the bark, look for the bottom of a large Douglas fir limb that may have a scar or look like it was fire pruned. There really evidence abounds, and it can just kind of help bring some insights into your particular patch of woods or an area that you know well.
I have another.
Yeah, go ahead, Rhonda.
I've been doing meadowscaping, and I'm so curious if there's any way to know where the prairies were throughout Puget Sound when the settlements began from non-native people. And there was an anecdote from somebody long ago that they remembered. It was like a grandfather talking or a grandmother talking, and she remembered the camas would be as far as your eye could see, and you couldn't tell where the blue sky started and the camas ended, and it was like miles from in Stillicum, miles and miles down the corridor of Puget Sound. So I'm always curious if there's some historical documentation showing where the prairies were, because my belief is that's where the burning was as well.
Yeah, and that's well, it reminds me, that's just sort of it is sort of a beautiful picture to evoke in our minds, right? What were these? I wish we could go back in time, right, and to see the tapestry of these prairies in their prime. and where they were, and how different the landscape was. But in answer to your question, like how do we really know? There has been some work on that area, and in fact, I can't recall at the moment some of the authors of some of the work, but there's some quite extensive research done to really try to reconstruct what we would consider the prairies up here in the San Juan Islands, as well as the rest of Puget Sound. And some of that's based on soil, characters of soil, and evidence on certain plants and the accumulation of organic material in those prairie plants, and some other ways too. But it has been done, and I know because I've seen some of the maps. It's quite interesting.
And I just noticed that Alex, our resource guru, just posted a link in the chat box to some resources. And looks like Ma Hanson there just put up a title to a book that she's been reading. Hi, Mom.
Book I brought from the library is called Indians, Fire, and the Land in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
That might answer some of your questions. I have no idea. I didn't look and see if the San Juan Islands are specifically mentioned. I don't see that they are, but there's lots of other stuff. And there are lots of maps and that sort of thing. I think it was published Oregon State University Press, and I thought it was somewhat older. I can't right now just see when it was, 1999.
Great.
That's the book that I've been reading over the last couple months. So we're good choice. It's a great one.
Robert Boyd is the editor. Indians, Fire, and the Land in the Pacific Northwest. Robert Boyd, B-O-Y-D.
Great.
And hurry up and finish that so I can check it out from the library.
Yeah.
Janet has her hand up.
Yeah, Janet.
Yeah, I have camas without deaf camas interspersed in it, and I just wonder if that indicates there were camas being managed and cultivated by indigenous people. It's just a guess.
Right? Yeah. I mean, I've been to your property, and it's you seem to have just the right conditions to have some camas. So I've often wondered that too. I mean, I've seen, little remnant patches, and does that indicate that it was being cultivated? I'm not sure, those are, I think, really good questions, in which I don't have the answer to.
I think, I worked closely with a colleague at the Tulalip Natural Resource Department around some area restoration and savanna work. And he's really indicated that it's the scale of camas production was so extensive, and currently we have right around 3% of the total Gary Oak savanna locations that we historically had pre-settlement, and so that is I don't know the data that Carson was referring to in terms of exactly where those pieces are mapped, but that does give an indication of so many of the areas now that we identify as, dug for forest, were not dug for a forest, 150 or 200 years ago. And I think one of the really interesting ways to sort of read some of that in the landscape is, do you see large amounts of large woody debris, or even just like berms of decaying old growth logs, or do you not, right? And there's some areas, I was just in one today on San Juan Island, where you have a lot of trees right at that 200-year age class, right? But then you see almost no down woody debris. And that's a really strong indication that those trees just started about 200 years ago, right? And that there were not these historic legacy trees in that site before then. And so there's some indicators that you can get in terms of what may have been savanna space, pre-settlement. And I think just the point I was trying to make earlier was just that if you think about these being the farmlands of Coast Salish people, and especially that the San Juan Islands had tribes coming from from the Gulf Islands, and then tribes coming all the way down from the South Puget Sound up to the islands. It was really this summertime multicultural meeting center. And so a lot of different tribes that didn't have more permanent residency in the islands still were coming through and involved in camas harvest. And so my understanding is that so many of these areas were certainly being actively cultivated. It wasn't just fire being put in the land for fire's sake. It was a strategy as a part of these cultivation techniques.
So the logs being down, that's a really interesting idea. I always just assumed that in the 1910s, when all the logging happened in the Thurston County area, that it was any big thing like that would no longer be on the land because of the logging. So but maybe there's another reason.
Yeah, and Thurston County is so different than San Juan County in terms of rainfall. But some research that I've examined has certainly indicated that nurse logs can, and even in San Juan County, the term nurse log may not even totally be appropriate all the time. But decomposition process can be 150 to 200 years. So it's these. They really are artifacts, right, that we can look at and then get this sense of historical presence and species types.
Did the loggers of the settlers remove the logs that were rotting and down, or did they leave them? I guess we don't know the answer to that. But that does go through my mind.
I think for the most part, logs were being taken that could be utilized either for timber or in San Juan Islands for the lime kilns. If they were already decaying, I think they were not fundamentally exported. Yeah.
That'd be my take on it also, that during the logging of most of the old growth, they were going after the premium timber. That's why we find that a lot of the remnant old growth trees tend to be the ones that have a lot of defect in them. Large limbs, broken tops, not good log quality. Well, it's 8:35, and I think out of respect for everybody's evenings, we usually try to keep our fireside chats to 1 hour. I thank you for joining us. We will continue the series again next month. We do not have a topic chosen for next month. We kind of like to spring it on you, surprise you. So we'll come up with that over the next month. If you have any ideas, if there's a particular topic that's at the top of your mind or warms your heart that you'd really like to have us dive into, feel free to message either Alex or myself, and either we will address it ourselves if it's within our wheelhouse, or we will find a specialist just like Carson and Kai to come in and talk about that. So with that, thank you again for joining us, and look forward to seeing you all next month and future months for the remainder of our fireside chats this evening. Thank you. Good night.